So welcome to this book talk about Jonas Schoenefeld's new book on invariation and climate governance. Jonas, I'm delighted to be introducing this. I had the pleasure of doing my PhD alongside with Jonas at UEA in Norwich some time ago. So Dr. Jonas Schoenefeld has been is back in Germany, has been a researcher at the Institute of Wohnen und Umwelt since October 2020, and he's previously worked also at the Technical University of Darmstadt, and is an expert in both kind of climate governance and general, but especially policy monitoring and evaluation at different governance levels, whether that's the EU or Germany or the UK, for example. Reacting to Jonas's presentation is going to be Dr. Paul Tobin, who's a senior lecturer in politics at the University of Manchester, where he leads on and specializes on environmental and European comparative politics and public policy. He has been writing a lot as well on climate governance at different levels, so I expect it's going to be a really interesting discussion between those two of them. The way we're going to run this is Jonas is going to speak for about 15-20 minutes, if I have it correctly, over to some slides giving us a taster for the book. And then Jonas and Paul will have a discussion around some of the aspects of the book that Paul found most interesting. And then we're going to open up to a Q&A more generally. So everyone is welcome to then put questions in the chat. And you can, and then when we go to the Q&A, we'll offer you the option to either, I'm happy to read out the questions, or if you want to ask the question live, you'll be able to turn on your camera, turn on your mic, and ask it directly. So that's all for me. I have a very light sharing role today because I know our two speakers are going to be fantastic. So I'm handing it over to Jonas, and at 20 minutes, I will be waving madly if you're still speaking, Jonas. So over to you.
Yes, thank you. Thank you very much, Vivian, and hello, everybody. Thank you for making the time to be here today. Thank you to UACES for hosting this virtual book launch, and of course to Vivian and Paul and everybody else who's been involved in organizing this book launch. I'll try and share some slides, which you should be able to see now. Let me start the presentation. Are we in presentation mode, Vivian? Is that looking good? Okay, excellent. I'll make this a little bit smaller so I can see the slides really well. So the evaluation of polycentric governance is the title of the book. I'm a researcher, as Vivian was saying, at the Institute for Housing and Environment. You can see the logo at the right top of the slide, in Darmstadt in Germany. And this book really culminates a journey of research, of learning, of writing, discussing, and so on, that spanned more or less the last 10 years. So a big moment. Thank you very much for being here today and for your interest in this work. Now, what I'll try and do in this presentation is to walk you through some of the elements that led to the research that this book presents, some of the conceptual elements in it, some of the findings, and then some of the conclusions that I drew in the book. But of course, there's much more, and I look forward to the discussion with Paul, with you, on various aspects contained here. So starting with the title and some of the main ideas, the book has a starting point in polycentric climate governance. So if there's anybody in the room who hasn't come in contact with this concept, that's no problem at all. Polycentric climate governance really hones in on the idea that governance, so steering different forms of climate action, could also, or in contrast to other approaches, happen in a decentralized way. So in the past, people have often thought about climate change governance in a fairly hierarchical way in terms of high-level negotiations and so on. But over time, and through the work of Elinor Ostrom, here's her key book on the right side on this slide, ideas on more decentralized forms of governance started emerging and also found their way into different types of agreement. I got the Paris Agreement here, certainly also elements of the European Green Deal, in order to reach targets like the net zero target in terms of reducing climate change causing emissions. Now, when you look at Elinor Ostrom's work in a paper in 2010, she wrote about polycentric governance systems being characterized by multiple governing authorities at different scales rather than a monocentric unit. So a chaotic system, well, not as chaotic as it may seem, and this is what I'll try to explain in this presentation. Now, one of the things that Elinor Ostrom raised in her early work, particularly her work on resource national governance, so things like fisheries, forests, and others, is that the issue of monitoring is important. And she wrote in her key book that, without monitoring, so looking at what's happening, there can be no credible commitment. And without credible commitment, there's no reason to propose new rules. So it is not anarchy. It is not a system without any rules. And those who are part of the system then may also be subject to monitoring and also participate in it. And I will get back to that in a little bit. Now, how do you then get from these ideas of monitoring, which were done in the case of sort of small and medium-sized resource systems, all the way to policy evaluation, which is a practice of retroactively assessing policies, which are sort of courses of action and to address climate change. And Elinor Ostrom not only said that monitoring was important, but she also said how monitoring can happen, tends to happen also with reference to empirical cases. And so she made a few claims that are important here, saying that monitoring is a context-sensitive exercise. It's not the same everywhere. And in some cases, it may be better or produce more favorable outcomes in the hands of localities. So rather than having, I don't know, a central police, she said it could be useful to have smaller units, maybe fishermen, for example, taking part or taking monitoring into their own hands and being part of the system, both in terms of appropriation and also monitoring. Elinor Ostrom also talked about multiple layers of nested enterprise, meaning that there are certain structures in the governance system and sometimes higher levels, like courts, for example, can play a role in terms of resolving conflict and contributing to ideas of monitoring. And then the physical properties of the resource also matters. It's different in her literature to, for example, monitoring, I don't know, fish in a lake and fisheries, or trees in a forest and others. But how do we get from this to these ideas of policy evaluation? Well, taking from these literatures and trying to really work out some foundational ideas of polycentric governance, I came up with three what I think are foundational ideas of polycentric governance, and which also are important for evaluation. Now, one is that actors can and do self-organize, including in the area of policy evaluation. Another one is that context matters, meaning that an evaluation needs to pay attention to different elements of context and cannot kind of be conducted exactly the same way everywhere. The same goes for climate governance. What may work in one place doesn't necessarily work in another. And governance centers, from a systemic perspective, according to these literatures, sort of have to interact to enable polycentric governance. Polycentric governance is not about atomized centers of governance that have nothing to do with each other and sort of engage in navel gazing and only their own problem solving, but only once they start paying attention to each other and perhaps learning from each other, competing with each other, is when you get interactions that then generate an overall governance system. And the question here then is, what role could policy evaluation play in terms of enabling that interaction? Which then led me to the following research questions and approach in the context of this book. To begin with, I asked, do actors self-organize in order to evaluate climate policy? And then, are climate policy evaluations context sensitive? If so, how? And to what extent do governance centers interact vis-a-vis climate policy evaluation? Is that one of the ways in which, for example, knowledge flows? And in order to do that, I assembled a new database of over 600 evaluations from the EU level, from Germany and the UK, both national level between 1997 and 2014, because the European Union had already been characterized as a particular polycentric way of governing things, including climate change. And then once that had been assembled, then I analyzed these evaluations with a newly developed coding scheme, which drew on the conceptual ideas I outlined earlier. Now I'll jump straight into some of the conclusions that I present in the book. Again, there's a lot more in there, but just to give you a flavor. So on this question of self-organization, I defined the difference between self-organization and non-self-organization here in terms of funding. So thinking about the impetus to evaluate and really thinking about money, resources being one of the key elements in it. And so when you look at this graph, 85% of the evaluations, here 542 in total, 85% of those were funded by the state or state-led organizations like the European Union. Whereas 15% of the evaluations were funded by other actors not linked to the state, like, for example, civil society organization, industry, or foundations. Now, what this means is that the overwhelming majority of evaluations is not self-organized or funded by non-governmental organizations, meaning that the state does play currently, or according to these data, a significant role in terms of evaluating in this polycentric system. But at the same time, self-organization does exist, and I will show on later slides what contributions it makes to the overall evaluation system, if you will. Now, unpacking this category of state-funded evaluation, so basically the 85% of the previous figure, a little bit more, I not only looked at who funded them, but I also said, who evaluated, and then what type of policy did they evaluate with a focus on the governance center. And what we see here is that typically evaluation gets contracted out, so somebody conducts it. What we see here is that evaluation tends to focus and to be run in the same governance center. So you can see German funders typically fund German evaluators to then evaluate German policy. Similar aspect for the UK, a little bit less so for the European Union, which then also funds other actors, and the other category below would be other countries and so on, also from Germany and the UK. But it is not sort of something that creates a huge amount of crossover between these governance centers. So this was for the state-funded, so non-self-organized evaluations by the definition in the book. Society-funded evaluations show a fairly similar pattern. Again, a strong focus here on evaluation in terms of funding, conducting it, and focus within the same governance centers. Maybe a little bit more crossover there, as you can see, but once again, it remains by and large sort of a governance center-driven activity. Now, moving on to the second foundational idea. The first one was this question of self-organization. Now we're moving on to the second one, which is the role of context. Now, the book defines context and attention to context in a number of different ways, which are on the outside of the spider web here, including time horizons, policy goals, geography, political environment, and others. All of these were assessed on a 4-point scale, with 0 being no attention and 4 being high level of attention. And what you can see here on this particular slide, I'm just going to have to move something on my screen here so I can actually see the legend myself, is that when you look at the different governance centers, so you can see the EU being the darker line here, then Germany, and then the UK, that the pattern is fairly similar. On most variables, there's limited and some attention to context, a little bit less so in the case of the UK than the two others. And some of the elements, geography, science, are much less addressed or taken into account than others, such as policy goals and time horizons. Now this then shows the same data, but cut in a slightly different way, meaning the difference between state-funded and society-funded evaluations. And this is something where you can see a bigger difference than the previous slide. So this goes across all of the 3 governance centers presented. And here you can see that really the non-state funded evaluations do have more or pay more attention to these contextual variables than the state-funded ones, and you see this almost across the board, with the exception maybe of time horizons. But once again, a difference between variables. But this slide really shows that the non-state funded evaluations do contribute to the system in a unique way. Oh, sorry, that was too quick. And then very briefly, governance center interactions. To what extent is evaluation maybe a way in which interactions may happen? There are a lot more variables in the book, but just to show you one, this shows the extent to which state-funded and non-state-funded evaluations pay attention to each other. Do they use findings from other types of evaluation? And here you can see sort of a different phenomena, in the sense that most state-funded evaluations actually do not pay attention to evaluations that are non-state funded, whereas it's the other way around for the non-state funded evaluations here described as informal. So again, you can see this is an indication of different practices depending on who funds the evaluations. Now this table, which is also available in the book, then kind of summarizes the findings. I won't go through all of the details here because of the time, but you can see the 3 foundational ideas on the right, and you can see that, in my view, both state-funded and non-state funded evaluations make unique contributions to the evaluation system, and on the whole create a system that has more diversity and I think more insight. So they are both monocentric, so more state-driven, and more polycentric elements in the system. So then a quick discussion, just a few things that I drew out of the conceptual work and the empirical analyses in this book. I think there are significant gains from bringing ideas on polycentrism, polycentric governance, and evaluation together. These literatures had previously been fairly disconnected from one another, also different communities and so on. But there's some good reason to bring them together, both in terms of theoretical and in empirical grounds, as the book shows. Now, evaluation does contribute, I think, to polycentric climate governance. To what extent this holds in other areas may be subject for other types of research, future research. But we can see that there is self-organization in climate policy evaluation, but it is limited. We've seen medium attention to context, so perhaps something where there's room for improvement, particularly for the state-funded evaluations. And interaction is limited to relatively standard aspects. Another variable in here was executive summaries that I didn't show, but once again, I think there is still room for improvement and for a stronger role of evaluation in polycentric climate governance. So they're both monocentric and polycentric elements, as I said, in the evaluation of polycentric climate governance. Quite a long sentence, but you can look at these monocentric and polycentric elements both in the governance system, and the evaluation of it, and also the evaluation that's being done can be more monocentric or polycentric itself. Some new research priorities that show up somewhat later in the book. One is on assessing causality. So this book was really in the early stages of trying to understand patterns and bring out some of these key ideas, also test the conceptual ideas. But I think assessing causality, what really drives, for example, state actors and non-state actors to fund evaluation and so on, is something that could be usefully explored. Also, the question of evaluation use, so to what extent are the evaluations then actually used, is something that could be further explored. Relationships between self-organization, contexts and interactions. This is something that I discuss in the book, but I think once again could be something that in the future could be empirically explored more. Linkages with other practices, for example, what role does evaluation play in sort of decentralized democratic systems, democratic practices, parliaments, and so forth. And then, of course, studying other policy areas beyond climate change to see whether these types of effects and patterns also emerge there. So this is the cover of the book. It appeared this July, published by Cambridge University Press. And I think I'll stop the presentation there. And thank you all for listening so far. And now look forward to Paul's points, the discussion, and also your thoughts and discussions. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Jonas. This is fantastic. Paul, I'm going to be turning over to you. All of us, if you start having, I mean, I know I already have some questions for Jonas. It might, like, if you're not really good with note-taking and all of this, you might want to already put them in the chat so that way you don't forget your questions while listening to Paul. So I look forward to seeing a busy chat. And for now, I'll hand over to Paul. Thank you.
Thank you, Viviane, and thank you so much, Jonas, as well, for this invitation to get to discuss your book. You asked me to do it prior to me seeing the book, and knowing what an excellent scholar you are, I didn't hesitate to say yes before I'd even seen the text, because I knew that whatever would be inside would be a fantastic contribution to the field. And that's absolutely what has been achieved here. If I may just give a little intro to the audience, I first was lucky enough to meet you, Jonas, through the InnerGov network, which I know you were heavily involved in and was co-hosted at UEA, particularly with Andy Jordan, who's in the audience, I see. And there was so many opportunities for people to work together from that network, and we're really seeing the fruits of that labour even years later. And so I remember discussing at a bus stop polycentric governance with you a matter of years ago, and here we are today. So that's a real pleasure for me. So I have read the book, as you can imagine, in quite a lot of detail, in full and excitedly as well. So being aware of the time I have and also the nature of this, we agreed that we'd have a bit of a conversation so that there's also scope for the audience. What I would say is that there are a number of avenues which I'd love to discuss, and I'm sure we'll get back to another time. But if I may be just unambiguously complimentary from the start, we have seen a lot of literature in the field on the creation of policies. We've seen a lot of literature on the dismantling of policies, the termination. This key step regarding monitoring and evaluation is often massively neglected by the field. There absolutely are superb studies in that area, but this volume is a real landmark contribution. It also is a landmark contribution because there's been so few actual empirical studies of polycentric climate governance. This is paramount. There has been great literature conceptually developing it. I know you are obviously heavily involved in the book, led by Andy Jordan, on polycentric climate governance, which is openly available, open access, and which you co-authored the opening chapter. But we really haven't seen as much empirical exploration as we would have wanted to necessarily by this point. So it's been extremely welcome. And for a third reason why it's a major filling in of a gap is that having this combination of the EU, the UK, and Germany as a supranatural national meets intergovernmental and unitary and federal state makes an extremely complementary structure for the book. It's a joy to read, it's concise, it's erudite, it's well supported throughout in every point it makes, and I'm very glad that I was asked to read the book. So if I may start to turn to some of the core ideas that we're going to discuss. So polycentricity then, as you can imagine, we're going to be talking about this a fair bit. I didn't send questions in advance as per our discussions, so this is going to be a real conversation. And for the benefit of the people in the audience, I saw on your final slide that you do differ again in your usage of polycentrism and then polycentric governance. And I think that area is something that will be really beneficial just to touch upon, if that's okay with you, Jonas, right at this stage, before we go any further, because I know in chapter 1 you detail the differences as you understand them. So for the benefit of the audience, if you wouldn't mind just talking a bit more about that.
Sure, yeah, and thank you very much for your kind comments and for reading the book end to end. Much appreciated, and for sharing here today. Yeah, I think this is something that I encountered relatively early in the research process. That there were quite a few different terms that were being tossed around throughout the literature, and that required, in my view, just some clarification. To understand what we were all talking about. And so I propose in the book a distinction between this idea of polycentricity, which basically just describes that there are many different centers that exist in a fairly descriptive way. And then in one way, and then on the other hand, polycentrism, as on the slide, which I use synonymously with polycentric governance, which then really gets into the systemic aspects. So different centers interacting with each other, could be through evaluation, could be through other things as well. And so then if you want, you kind of get a continuum. You can say you can get from polycentricity to polycentric governance, polycentrism, or be anywhere in between, to the extent that there are interactions between these governance centers. And I thought it would be sort of a nifty little way of looking at this and trying to understand at which state different systems may be, because polycentric governance, in my view, isn't sort of a binary thing. It's not you're either polycentric or you're monocentric. These are kind of extreme ends of a continuum. Hope that makes some sense.
Absolutely, and I would strongly recommend to anyone interested in polycentric governance to read chapter 1 or is teaching on that topic, because that is a contribution in its own right. I think it's actually quite understated in the book, but I found that clarity in chapter 1 particularly helpful. So then we turn to what that actually means in practice. So as I mentioned already, you were involved in the book lead edited by Andy Jordan with the opening chapter where 5 core propositions of polycentric climate governance were outlined, whereas in this book you have 3. Those 5 in the co-authored chapter that you wrote were overarching rules, mutual adjustment, trust, experimentation, and local action. So 5 core areas. Whereas in the volume here, you've kind of made a focus on 3 foundational ideas, which, in my opinion, makes it more straightforward for scholars in future to apply a polycentric framework to their analysis. It's a bit more streamlined, it's a bit more focused. But nevertheless, I would welcome hearing just a few reflections on why you chose to do that, because, there's a core text. Many scholars have referred to those 5 core propositions. You're a co-author of that piece. Vincent Ostrom, for example, had 4 kind of key pieces regarding municipal governance in the 1960s. So why those specific 3 that you outlined before? And whether you want to share your slides or not from earlier to remind the audience, I don't know, but that would be a welcome contribution too.
Sure, yeah. Did you mean that slide with the core proposition with that table on there? Yeah, I can, let me see whether I can share that again so people can just follow while I'm talking about this. Here we go. Okay, can you, no, I need to, hang on.
I'm giving you a multitasking task here. Talk about your book.
And difficult thing. Okay, now I should be, let's see, get the right one here. Okay, how's that looking? Is that good? Okay, good. So yeah, so you got the 3 foundational ideas on the left: self-organization, context, and interaction that Paul was mentioning, and then of course you got the 5 proposition in the edited volume, to which I also contributed, and as you were saying, Paul, different ideas. Now, maybe I'll talk a little bit about where these 3 come from, because I think that then helps to understand why they're here. To me, really, the origin of thinking about policy evaluation kind of harks back to this idea of monitoring, because I needed some sort of starting point in the literature, a conceptual starting point that helped me to move conceptually and then also empirically to this idea of policy evaluation. And these are some of the core things that show up over and over again in Elinor Ostrom's work and also in other associated publications. So I thought, in terms of developing these ideas and really finding the ideas that seem most relevant to try and bringing these two things together, these would be, as you were saying, Paul, most streamlined and will help to sort of also drive empirical analysis, because this is something that I really wanted to do in the book. I didn't just want to present a conceptual argument that was hopefully going to be coherent and understandable, but also then to translate this into some real empirics. Now, of course, other propositions like, for example, trust or overarching governance centers aren't entirely disconnected from this. And it is certainly possible to think about, let's say, ideas of trust in the context of evaluation and how that may relate to each other. And the same goes for overarching governance centers, which, you can think about the EU level maybe as an overarching governance center, and then think about what this means. And I get back to a number of these ideas in the text, so they're definitely in there and are worth exploring. But I think for the purposes of this particular analysis, it seemed like a good idea to streamline a little bit. But I think, in future, if anyone wanted to take, let's say, the idea of trust and see how that hangs together with evaluation, then that's something that could be done. But in my view, that will also require different methodology and different approaches from what was done here in the book. I mean, this was very much based on document analysis and really sort of looking across a whole number of evaluations across these three different governance centers. And so exploring things like trust, for example, I think would perhaps require maybe survey research, maybe interview-based research. So getting very close to individual evaluations and so on. And I'm aware of a number of pieces that are now slowly emerging in the field where people have started doing this, and I think that's very, very welcome and amounts to important contributions.
Thank you, Jonas. I mean, this is exactly what I was hoping to be able to do, is discuss and just flag a few key areas that I do feel are almost modestly hidden away as excellent contributions. And I think as I say, the streamlined nature of this focus in terms of how to apply the framework in future research is most welcome. So then, turning to some of your findings, what's so refreshing about the book is that, yes, you take this polycentric framework based around your core understandings, and yet, for example, as you find regarding state-funded evaluations, they are, in your own words, by definition, not self-organizing, in that the original impetus to conduct them comes from state actors. Meanwhile, state-funded evaluations are engaged at best in a cursory treatment of context, the second key area, and finally interactions between governance centres taking place through or enabled by evaluations is limited among the state-funded evaluations. So what we have in a nutshell is then, regarding these three core areas, your argument is that regarding state-funded evaluations, we're not seeing that polycentric governance, that polycentrism, to use the other word that we were just explaining, yet you are using polycentricity as a lens to analyze those, enabling to focus in on certain core themes, but you are not arguing that they manifest as polycentric governance. Which brings me to one of my more provocative questions then, which is to look at the actual title of the book, The Evaluation of Polycentric Climate Governance. Could it be, additionally, as well, or alternatively rather, the polycentric governance of climate evaluation? I'll say that again because I'm using exactly the same words, people in the audience, but it's a different focus. The book is called The Evaluation of Polycentric Climate Governance, but what I'm suggesting is it could also be the polycentric governance of climate evaluation. And I'd be intrigued to hear any reflections you have there regarding the path that you chose to go down in terms of that focus, because I think the book contributes in a number of areas.
Yeah, I think this is a really, really well taken point. And I think it gets back to one of the things that I spend quite a time thinking about, and I don't think it's fully resolved in the book, to be honest. Maybe other people will in the future contribute ideas to this. So you get in effect you get, if you will, two systems. You get, the climate's governance system in terms of a system producing policies and approaches and so on, and then you get an evaluation system. But when you start analyzing this, you find that empirically the two get so closely bound up with one another that it becomes somewhat difficult, to completely pry them apart, because one could argue that in the end, evaluation practices are just as much part of the governance system of governing climate change as, I don't know, producing policies, agenda setting, and what have you. So you get all these different elements, and one thing is, just to say, if you have a polycentric system like the European Union, as many have argued, then does policy evaluation happen within it, and if so, who does it? And so on. So and this is one part of what the book does. But then on the other hand, you can also say, if there is evaluation, then what structure does evaluation produce, and how does it look, and what does it amount to, and and then apply the whole thrust of ideas almost again to the evaluation system. And it is true that the book in many ways does both things, and yeah, it then becomes sort of a matter of emphasis, I think, in terms of the title, in terms of saying, is it the polycentric governance of climate policy evaluation, or the evaluation of climate policy governance? I did co-publish together with Andy Jordan a kind of paper that kind of flips it the other way around, that has a focus on the governance of evaluation. And there really we try and flesh out, it was published in the journal Evaluation, and they really flesh out sort of different options for governing evaluation. It was something that would have gone significantly beyond the book, so we decided to sort of put it outside in a different publication. But there we really say, if, let's say, the European Union thinks about setting up evaluation and organizing it, then what options are there between the kind of more monocentric and more polycentric, and what could that mean for practices of evaluation and so on? And so, yeah, try to flesh out some of these arguments there. But it's well taken that that the book kind of tries to do two things at the same time, to a certain extent.
I mean, it accomplishes two things as well, and it's nice to be in the position of being spoilt for choice, because your book makes too many contributions that you don't know which, clearly you do know, but one is spoilt for choice as to which focus to include within the title. So if I may just touch upon some of those contributions a little bit more. I don't know if there's many policymakers in the room, but chapter 4 and chapter 5. So chapter 4 is about state-funded evaluations. Chapter 5 is about society-funded evaluations. The empirical richness of these chapters cannot be overstated. So the sheer skill that you demonstrate here, Jonas, in terms of bringing in analysis of variance, ANOVA, bringing in the spider plots, box plots, the image you showed, I don't actually know what that's called, with the wavy lines. I don't know what that's called, but super clear. You are demonstrating a large amount of new data that people in the field haven't seen before, and you're doing so in an extremely accessible way. And it makes chapters 4 and 5 for anyone teaching, say, policy studies, policy evaluation, European Union politics, the raw materials they need to see how that can be done extremely well. And it's a testament to your methods and research skills that those chapters are possible. As we move then on to some of the implications of these findings, so I just touched upon state-funded, society-funded, and if you look into the index of the book, you talk about actors, and you divide these into local, non-state, and state actors. But I am interested in the role of agency here, the individual dimension, insofar as if self-organization isn't quite what we're seeing in certain situations, but also it is because the impetus isn't always being provided by the state. State actors are going beyond their requirements. Where is that coming from? What is the role of individual agency here? Did you have any areas where you had perhaps findings that, because the book already is rich enough as it is, you weren't able to bring it in, or is that an area that you're looking to study in the future? I'd love to hear any thoughts on the role of individuals within these state and societal funded evaluation systems as well.
Yeah, I mean, this touches on sort of a broader question of trying to really understand this idea of self-organization, because you're quite right that Elinor Ostrom in her early work, and also Vincent Ostrom, they were looking at individuals. They were looking at, for example, fishermen managing their own fisheries and or lobster fishes or what have you. And so now in this book, I sort of try to extend this idea and say self-organization in a much broader conceptual way than looking at individuals. And yet I'm coming from sort of a set of concepts that were developed in an individual environment, or an environment where, you know, people were studying individuals. And so I think it does work conceptually in terms of you know, making that switch, going from one to the other. And yet it very much then generates new questions about, as you were saying, so you get these state agencies, or you get entire organizations, and, you know, where does agency come from within these organizations? Because in the end of the day, organizations are made up of people who then engage in these evaluation practices and so on. So it is not something that at the individual level, it's not something that comes through closely in the book. It's not something that, you know, I focused on in the book, because in the end of the day, most of these evaluations had that strong institutional basis, were often conducted by consultants, by groups of people, and so on, where then, you know, you'd have to think. I made that conceptual distinction in terms of the funding and the impetus, because there is research saying that previous research saying that those who fund then also may influence evaluations and outcomes. So there's a strong, potentially strong connection there, also room for politics and influence and so on. So this is not all a neutral sort of space. But I think it would be useful to kind of explore these categories further. And I'm not saying that this particular conceptualization of self-organization is the best or the right or whatever one could say. It's one proposal in order to try and understand these documents, but I'm aware of and interested in to see others who may maybe look at this in a different way, also considering whatever it is that people are studying. I think it sort of has to fit the particular context, and with that, I guess we're back at the beginning.
Excellent, thank you, Jonas. So you did touch upon in your answer there the comparative dimension. I think that is really important as well, just to underscore here, which is that this is not just making contribution to EU, UK and German climate politics, and it's not just to evaluation, but we're also looking at a comparative study that's very well done. Chapter 7 is an explicitly comparative chapter that compares the findings of chapter 5 regarding state and chapter 6 regarding, oh sorry, I've got those. 4 is the state, 5 is society, and then 6 is the comparative chapter. And so that comparison then is rich in terms of the implications that we see regarding polycentric governance / polycentricity, depending on which part of the contribution you are focusing on. If I may ask for us to just go back to that table 6.2 again, which is how I have it in my notes, but you were just showing us, because not only does it show those 3 core dimensions, it also has some of the core overall findings for the book. And I bring it up, this is going to be my last real area, because otherwise I'll get told off for getting too excited and going well beyond my time of getting to ask questions. But this is the core set of findings for the book, if I may be so bold as to suggest that. And there's so many questions that one could ask about where this has come from, why that's the case, regarding these findings. And so my main point then is, we've got this slide now open in front of everyone. you've suggested in your suggestion going forward for the creation of a database regarding policies regarding evaluation. That's one of the core policy proposals that you come out with regarding the book. What areas would you hope to explore in further detail if you had access to such data? So this is a lot of contributions to a field, and each one is extremely well supported in the volume. But in what ways could such a database that you call for at the end of the book support future research going forward?
Yeah, I'll stop the sharing again, because then we can sort of see each other. And yeah, I very much agree. I think this study is only the beginning, I think, of further studies. And fortunately, we've seen some efforts to create these kinds of databases. I also reference those in the book. For example, the European Environment Agency recently again contracted a consultant to really pull together a database. And I think there are a number of ways in which this could help. One is, of course, to understand developments over time. I had to cut off in 2014 because the analysis that I conducted was rather time consuming, and then turning that into a book and all the rest of it, it just takes time. But really trying to understand the development of the evaluation system. When you look at my data, you can see that back in the early 90s, there was very little evaluation, and then all of a sudden it sort of went up and kind of ends at a fairly high level. And this would be something that'd be interesting just to see how is the system doing, what's the system producing, and is this balance between the state-funded and the non-state funded something that changes over time. This is something that again, I couldn't quite do in the book, because we're looking at a system that was almost developing exponentially over time. And so I think the time series is just a little bit too short to kind of really look at these developments. But this is something that people could do. And then also in terms of using the knowledge that is actually in the evaluations for policy development. I mean, we as scientists, we're fairly used to having fairly large databases of all the knowledge that has been produced, of articles and books and all the rest of it. We're able to kind of keyword search those and use AI and what have you to really try and draw out the knowledge that has already been produced. Whereas what one observes in the evaluation field is that there's a lot more cyclical work. Often evaluations hark back to things that have already been done earlier and so forth. So really kind of bringing together that knowledge and harnessing what's already there. I think this is something that a database that's well done and that's usable could produce and really drive another stage of policy development, which really looks at what's been done in the past. That said, though, and again, it's something that comes through in the book a little bit, but it's not, I'd say, its main focus at this stage. Is there is also politics, there are interests involved here, and so on. And something we've observed is that not all actors are particularly interested in looking at the past, particularly if the past wasn't a successful one. So this is something to keep in mind and to think. But I think organizations like the European Environment Agency, perhaps also non-state organizations, can contribute here in terms of bringing that knowledge together and trying to provide, let's say, a politically more neutral platform that can provide some of that knowledge, and then perhaps also over time things like meta studies and others. And I think I'll stop there. So yeah, we can have some more questions now.
Absolutely. I'd love to hand straight over to Viviane now and thank Jonas again for the opportunity to play some small role in helping to shine a light on all the different contributions you've made. If you are a policy studies person, a European Union politics person, a climate politics person, or simply a scholar of politics writ large who wishes to see how a rich monograph can be written, then I would strongly suggest this volume is next on your reading list. Absolutely.
Thank you, Paul.
Thank you both. And I would also suggest that if you ever launch a book, you should have Paul for you to discuss it. Because in terms of both the quality of the question and the amount of compliments, very well deserved, but still really impressive.